Samson is deceived by Delilah. God mercifully makes Samson strong one last time. A man named Micah makes up his own religion, and Jesus is the Good Shepherd. Today on 3 in 1, as we consider Judges chapter 16 through 18 and John chapter 10. Judges chapter 16 is a difficult chapter to read, isn't it? Many of us probably grew up thinking of Samson as some sort of biblical superhero, but he was really more of an anti-hero rather than a superhero. An inwardly conflicted, outwardly sinful and selfish man that was still graciously and mercifully used by God. And I think that at the end, Samson took all of that for granted, thinking that there was nothing that he could do to lift the hand of the Lord, and so that he could live any way that he wanted. Samson's life was quite the quandary. Pastor David Guzik had this to say: despite his sin, God still gave Samson supernatural strength. God did this because God's purpose was bigger than Samson himself, and because God used Samson despite Samson's sin, not because of it. In this we see the strongest man in the world weak under the power of an ungodly relationship. Perhaps Samson figured that because he was strong in one area of his life, he was strong in all areas. In this he was desperately wrong. Samson didn't humble himself in obedience before God. He insisted on the freedom of doing what he wanted to do. This left him with no freedom at all. Sin has its wages, and this was Samson's payday. His sin left him blind, in bondage, and a slave. Before, Samson's blindness, bondage, and slavery were only inward, but they were eventually outward. In summary, Samson shows the danger of underestimating our own sinfulness. He probably figured he had things under control with his own fleshly lusts. But his desire for love, romance, and sex led directly to his destruction. Samson was the great conqueror who never allowed God to properly conquer him. Oh, that should shake us to the core. Have mercy on us, Jesus. Save us, rescue us from ourselves. Now, as chapter 17 begins, a man named Micah steals 1,100 shekels of silver, equivalent to 110 years' worth of a working wage. He steals it from his mom, and then he returns it to his mom, and then his mom blesses him and uses some of the money to make a carved, molded image to be used in the house of Micah. A messed up, man-made religion. Now, remember Aaron's golden calf? Aaron's golden calf was made to represent God, the one true God. So we don't know if this carved and molded image was made to represent a false God or made to represent the one true God. But what we do know is that both of those were expressly forbidden by God. Man always wants to make God in his own image, instead of realizing it's the other way around. But the ease of which the morality is confused in this passage is starting to show us that the people have really lost their moral bearings, and they are beginning to do what is right in their own eyes, instead of being careful to find out what is right in the eyes of God. In verse 5 of chapter 17, it said, "The man Micah had a shrine, and made an ephod and household idols, and he consecrated one of his sons who became his priest. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." Micah is a clear illustration of man-made religion. He makes a carved image, he makes a shrine, he makes religious garments, he makes his son a religious leader. All of this apart from the direction of God. It was simply what was right in his own eyes. But this has always been and will always be extremely destructive. We have to constantly evaluate what we do and why we do it, and be careful to cleanse ourselves of the ways and traditions of man so that they do not hinder the directives and the truths of God and of God's word. Well, Micah continues to go from bad to worse as he willy-nilly creates this own way to worship. He even goes as far as hiring his own in-house priest and thinks that that's going to get him the blessing of God. In verse 12 of 17, it says, "Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest, and lived in the house of Micah. Then Micah said, 'Now I know that the Lord will be good to me, since I have a Levite as a priest.'" He is sorely mistaken, and he's headed down the wrong path. And in chapter 18, we see that there were others who were willing to follow. From bad to really bad. First off, the tribe of Dan wimps out and refuses to fight by faith. And looking for an easier land to conquer, they bump into this priest who is prostituting his God-given gifts. So the sinful Danites ask the sinful priest to inquire of a holy God about whether or not he is going to bless their life of compromise and neglect. And the priest says, "Go in peace. The presence of the Lord be with you on your way." Man, how many times have priests for hire said this very thing? Go in peace. The Lord is with you. And the sinful, compromised people mumble back, and also with you. And no one cares. This is the spiritually deadening aspect of man-made ritual. Okay, back to the happy story of Micah and the Danites. The Danites decide to steal Micah's man-made religion, including the carved images, the religious clothing, even his in-house priest. And the priest was happy to go to get a pay increase. It's a sad story. Micah makes his own gods, and man-made gods can't defend themselves, and so somebody takes them. Micah gets mad and goes to get them back, yells at the ones who stole his man-made gods, and they say, "Keep quiet or we'll beat you up." And he tucks his tail between his legs and goes home, because they were too strong for him. See, when men do what is right in their own eyes, apart from being under the authority of the King of Kings, sin always takes more than it gives. And it always eventually ends up in this disgusting mess of cowardly compromise and destruction. God, give us the courage to fight every single day, to obey you in word, in deed, in thought, even in the meditation of our hearts. Please, Jesus. Okay, on to our New Testament reading, John chapter 10, where we see Jesus talk about being the Good Shepherd. In verse 1 it said, "Most assuredly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. Yet they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers." I love this picture that Jesus is painting for us. Jesus comes into the sheepfold of the world and calls us out by name. He leads us out of this mess, and we follow him because somehow we know his voice, and his voice is the only one that we will follow. Jesus used this illustration, but they did not understand the things which he spoke to them. Sadly, the Pharisees didn't have ears to hear. They didn't recognize Jesus' voice because they weren't his sheep. He wasn't their shepherd. But in his great grace, Jesus begins to explain what he meant in giving this illustration. As he explains, listen to the contrast he makes between the one who is willing to lay down his life for the sheep and the ones who are only in it for themselves. It's quite the contrast. Now, it's interesting, as we read today, Jesus is literally teaching a verse-by-verse Bible study of what he said in verses 1 through 5. And we'll take it a verse at a time as we go back through it as well. In verse 7, it says, "Then Jesus said to them again, 'Most assuredly I say to you, I am the door of the sheep.'" The sheepfold. It would be surrounded by a low wall made of stones with only one way in and one way out. The shepherd would lie down in that opening at night and literally become the door, laying down his life for the sheep. This would keep the sheep safe in a couple of ways. It would keep them from wandering off, and it would keep predators from sneaking in. In verse 8, "All who ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them." Sometimes we forget Jesus' day was flooded with people claiming to be the Messiah, but his sheep didn't hear them. They didn't recognize their voice. Verse 9, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and will go in and out and find pasture." The sheep under Jesus' care could be calm enough to graze in peace because they knew that Jesus was on watch. He was scanning for predators, and if any of them came to harm the sheep, he was right there to step in and lay down his life for the sheep. I love that picture in Psalm 23 where David says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Verse 10, The thief does not come except to steal and to kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. Here again is the contrast between the thief, who came to steal, kill, and destroy, and the good shepherd, who came so that we could have life and life abundantly. We all serve somebody. And if you serve sin, the ultimate thief, it will always take more than it gives. Yes, it does give pleasure for a season, but that season is short, kind of like our summers. And then the thief always takes more than it gives, and the winter of our discontent begins. The problem is, the buyer's remorse of serving sin is death. Eventually, there won't be anything left to take from you but your life. But in contrast to the thief, Jesus said, I have come that they may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. And how did he plan to provide that abundant life? Listen again closely to the following verses. Verse 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. But a hireling, he who is not the shepherd, one who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. The hireling flees because he is a hireling and does not care about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and I am known by my own. As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Oh, how I love my Jesus, and oh, how I want to be more like him. Jesus illustrates the difference between a God-given position and a job. See, the hireling runs and abandons the sheep when the wolf comes. The good shepherd lays down his life. He literally stands in between the wolf and the sheep and says, over my dead body. Verse 16. And the other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. Here, Jesus is talking about us, Gentiles. When Jesus calls out his own from the world's sheepfold, there will no longer be Jew or Gentile, slave or free. We are all one in him. We are all followers of Jesus. Verse 17. Therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have the power to lay it down, and I have the power to take it again. This command I have received from my Father. This is interesting to me. I understand the power of the resurrection. I understand how Jesus had the power to take up his life again. What's interesting to me here is that Jesus said that he has the power to lay his life down. That's the power that we need, isn't it? Jesus, you laid your life down so others could live. And we want to do the same. Help us to live that way today, to have the courage to fight, to obey you in every way.